Okay, there's a lot to get into tonight. Probably going to do this for about an hour or so. If you're in the room, please retweet the space. Let's see if we can bring others in here. If you want to come up on stage, just raise your hand. I'll have you up. Mostly, we're going to be talking about the stuff that's over on my Substack, though there's a few ideas that I'm kind of playing with here and there. But yeah, I'm generally speaking, I'm pretty excited about the direction a lot of things are going in, and kind of want to give some account as to why. So, first things first, I think what we should really think about is like, how did we get to a situation in which we just saw one of the shortest lived speakers of the House that we've ever had? How did that sort of happen? And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about how this went down. And I think what it really kind of started on is the kind of collision course that Gen X, conservatives and millennial conservatives are on, and that basically there's a kind of fight over the future of the Republican Party. What is it going to look like? What's it going to be about? Who are going to be its leaders? All these things. And of course, there's the Kevin McCarthy relationship with the state of Israel. Obviously, we saw what happened with Robert Menendez, and we saw the kind of interesting coalition of eight members of Congress who took out Kevin McCarthy. So there's a lot of fun things going on here. My read on it, for what it's worth, and I should say, like, I'm not a Kevin McCarthy fan. I've written about a lot of his corruption. I've actually filed FBI reports about his corruption. And by the way, it does seem to me, from what I understand from various friends of mine in the government, that there are inquiries into corrupt things that Kevin McCarthy did, and that it's actually much easier for him to go down now that he is out of the speakership. So if we just got rid of a corrupt member of Congress, that's kind of good enough. But yeah, I mean, the thing to understand in general is that McCarthy's had a long-standing relationship with the Israelis and with the sort of mob elements within California politics, kind of generally, and basically within Bakersfield, California specifically. And I've known Kevin McCarthy now since 2010, 2011. And he's been pretty much a shit ever since that I first met him. Whether that's been cheating on his wife, whether that's been, weird deals to rip off the Navy at the China Lake Naval Air Station, whether that's been, basically working to get his African American studies a major son, who's white, by the way, a job working for the Koch brothers or for Joe Lonsdale. Lonsdale being somebody who ripped off Medicare with this company, Ubiome, that he was a backer of. That's the one where they shit in the bags and sent the shit in. That company where the founders are at large in, living in Germany. So McCarthy's like a really bad guy. And there's like a lot of things pointing at like why he's a bad guy. We can go into that if people want to go into it. I'm more than happy to talk chapter and verse on that. I've written a lot about it at my Substack. If you just search it, you'll find what I'm talking about. Charles Johnson Substack. Maybe Tom, maybe put that up in the Jumbotron. Some of the stuff I've done on McCarthy, particularly the family affair stuff. I also gave stuff to Laura Loomer about it. So like, I'm not a McCarthy fan. Like, it is my hope and prayer that he ends up in federal prison at some point. I think that's not crazy. It certainly has a lot of Menendez-ish vibes to it, and so I'm very happy to see Matt Gaetz take him down. Now, there's all this stuff about how Gaetz was upset about the ethics inquiry. All of that stuff's fake. Basically, what happened was Matt Gaetz invited me to the State of the Union in 2018. While I was serving, basically as a Fed for the government, I was basically neutralizing a lot of foreign spies and foreign agents who wanted to be in the Trump government. The Israelis did not like that, so they hounded me out of the positions that I was in, smearing me and trying to ruin me, particularly targeting me on the things I was working on in genetics and in facial recognition, both areas in which the Likud Israelis were, until the last few years, further ahead than the United States. So, they'd smear me in like the Huffington Post. I'd then sue them. It was like a giant kind of like spy versus spy kind of thing. And it was fun as fuck. I'm not going to lie about it. And I ultimately won. So it all worked out in the end. But basically, the way it works is that the Israelis and the Chinese if you're working on something that competes with their businesses, they sort of see it as like no holds barred. Like they'll hack you, they'll target your businesses, they'll make shit up about you. It really is that wild. And Tom's followed some of this, others in the space have followed some of this, and like it really is as crazy as I say. And in fact, if anything, I might be understating how crazy the whole situation was. But in any event, what happens is Gates invites me to the State of the Union. He gets all this pressure from McCarthy and from others about bringing a Holocaust denier, oh no, to the State of the Union. And Gates defends me multiple times to Jake Tapper, who's very plugged in with the Israelis, defends me on CNN. We sort of become friends after that. And all this time, Gates gets harassed about a relationship with me. Yeah, you just see here, that is the world headquarters of the Native American contracting construction firm, which Kevin McCarthy's brother-in-law used to get all of these government contracts for the China Lake Naval Air Station. And I'm not a fan of Kevin McCarthy. Like, I believe one day he will go to jail. And given how compromised the FBI was in LA, something that Jonathan Buma and others kind of exposed, maybe one day that will happen because Bakersfield's closest kind of FBI office is in LA. So anyway, long story short, Gates was in a kind of fight with Kevin McCarthy, and there's lots of angles to this, right? So one of Kevin McCarthy's largest donors is Palmer Luckey. Palmer is the brother-in-law of Matt Gaetz. Matt is married to Ginger Luckey. I introduced the two of them at Mar-a-Lago, Ginger and Matt. So there's a sort of like personal kind of thing on this. Gates gets targeted by the Israelis and by Bill Barr in large measure because Gates is coming out against all this Chinese spyware, against Pegasus, against all this Israeli and Chinese spyware in the DOJ, particularly around the DJI drones. So they come after Gates. Gates manages to survive because people like me and others had his back, and because we were noticing the role of people like Jake Novak, who was involved in kind of smearing Gates. And I think there was a great post by Arthur Bloom about all this that Gates himself replied to. So I think that is a kind of interesting kind of angle here. And of course, we should also note that Gates finally got Mike Johnson in. But Gates was cool with Tom Emmer. Tom Emmer was very much supportive of having Ilhan Omar get her committee seats restored. Ilhan Omar is very close to the CIA. We've talked about Ilhan Omar's relationships with the CIA, namely that her father was an informant for the CIA for many, many years, and that Ilhan Omar is a threat to the kind of Netanyahu world that wants to kind of mainstream, doesn't want Muslim views to be mainstreamed. Okay, Gates survives all these attacks against him. He gets a clean bill of health, the FEC, all the basically, the FBI, all the DOJ, all the basic government groups come after him. He beats all of them. But that's not enough. Kevin wants to investigate his personal life. And so he has basically a sham trial, a house ethics thing. So get this, the deeply corrupt guy in the form of Kevin McCarthy is the one like basically okaying all the ethics stuff. That's how fucked up we're talking about how the Congress is, that the most unethical people end up being on the ethics committee. So that's kind of how that goes. So anyway, Gates survives. Kevin's pissed. Kevin still hates him. Kevin sees Gates as a threat to the kind of status quo. And it should be noted too that so Kevin is raising all this money with the help of Jeff Miller. Jeff Miller is somebody who got in trouble with all this illegal fundraising for the Kochs back in the day in California. But Jeff Miller is basically the bag man for Kevin McCarthy. And I've tweeted about Jeff Miller a bunch. If people are curious, they can kind of go there. So anyway, Kevin ultimately gets defeated. He repeatedly knifes the various people. They finally bring in Mike Johnson. And let me just say, obviously Tom Emmer was my preferred candidate. I know Tom Emmer a little better. I know his staff. I think Tom Emmer actually has ideas about how to do things like reduce the deficit. He has a kind of vision for where he wants the country to be. But I'm ultimately kind of okay with him just being majority leader or with being whip or whatever and not ultimately becoming speaker, because I think there's 18 Democrat leaning districts, or basically seats that went for Biden, that are represented by Republicans. And it seems pretty likely to me, anyway, that the Democrats are going to take the House of Representatives, come the 2024 election. And in some respects, like having a Mike Johnson there, uh, who's really kind of antediluvian in his thinking. I mean, he really is like kind of a throwback to the compassionate conservatism. He feels very 2006 Republican Party, right? Like obsessed about gay marriage, obsessed about abortion, involved with the Family Research Council. We can go into that in a second, and kind of my own personal relationship with the Family Research Council. All that said, I've had maybe like half dozen conversations with Mike Johnson, maybe slightly more than that. And he's a pretty earnest guy. Like he genuinely believes what he believes, or at least he's very good at faking it. And I've kind of spent a lot of time thinking about him, just as kind of like an interesting figure. So, for one, if anyone spent any time in Louisiana, you know that it's basically a competing series of mobs, and that these competing series of mobs are kind of all at war with each other. And the way to kind of understand Mike Johnson is he's kind of from the redneck part of the state, Shreveport. He's not from the kind of Cajun mafia part of the state, the part that like just elected Jeff Landry Landry to be the governor. So he's from like basically the redneck part. And a way to think about Louisiana politics generally is it's a kind of war between the redneck mob and the Cajun mob. And Johnson is on the kind of like redneck side of it. But Johnson is not he's not basically a Dixie mob figure. In fact, throughout his career, he's like bringing the hurt to the various Dixie mob affiliated entities. So he's like fighting to shut down porn shops. One of the conversations he and I had a while back was about how he wanted to ban Pornhub because he saw Pornhub as basically a giant trafficking syndicate. So this was something I talked to him with about like maybe 2 years ago. He was like really interested in that kind of question. And I talked to him a little bit about how I suspected that Pornhub was a kind of like intelligence gathering tool, that it was basically tracking what everybody was looking at in terms of pornography. And he found that very interesting from like a national security perspective. He also expressed to me one of the times that he and I spoke about basically how the oil infrastructure in a lot of Louisiana was penetrated by the Chinese, and his sort of general concern that all of the infrastructure in Louisiana could be shut down by a hostile actor. What was striking to me too is that he and I had a number of conversations, and unlike a lot of the other evangelical types or Baptist types, he never really mentioned the whole Israel of the thing. Now, obviously there's videos of him talking about being pro-Israel. Even Matt Gaetz will talk about Judea and Samaria, basically to get the Israelis off his scent. So none of that kind of like frightens me all that much. I think it's just sort of like, it's like performative politics. He just needs to say it, move on, whatever, fine. But what's interesting to me about Johnson is like this is the kind of zeal of somebody who's actually like a sincere convert. So, when he talks about being pro-life, I mean, it's a little different when you're kind of like, intellectually pro-life. It's a totally different thing than when you're like born to a 17-year-old mother, right? So like obviously the pro-life issue is like deeply personal to him. And there's a lot of focus on like how he adopted a black son aged 25, and his son was like 14 or whatever, or he had a sort of quasi adoption. None of that terribly surprises me either, having lived in Texas and spent time in Louisiana, Mississippi, and even in Dana's Alabama. There's these kind of like informal family relationships that take place a lot in the South. And if like you watch The Blind Side, and I know that's imperfect given all the history that's come out about Michael Lewis, and these kind of books and like their problems or whatever. But basically, like I've seen this kind of thing where people will take in other people's children an awful lot in the South. And I have second cousins that live in Shreveport, and like this is not uncommon in this part of like the country. So that doesn't surprise me all that much. What I do find interesting is, here he is. He's living in this redneck district. It's a very poor district. And he's basically working his way up. He's got a father that had burns over 80% of his body from basically an accident, an industrial accident. And by the way, Johnson's record on worker safety is actually like pretty good as far as Republicans go. And then you have this other sort of aspect of it that he's like involved with this Alliance Defending Freedom, or what was previously known as the Alliance Defense Fund. And this is kind of like a good way to think about it is it's kind of like where the deep state meet the weird evangelical Christians. So that would be kind of like the frame that I would have on it. And the old joke was that CIA stands for Christians in Action. Um, and he's very much kind of like of that school. And many of the people I kind of know socially who know him, that's kind of what that is. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how he was a seditionist, but I remember this period pretty well. In fact, I did a lot of recordings for it for the FBI before I was canceled as a confidential human source, studying like who were the movers and shakers in the whole January 6th of the thing. And Johnson was kind of like, he was not really that big a player. He sort of treated it like, well, Trump is entitled to his day in court. He wasn't like a mover and shaker like some of the others. And I think he honestly was kind of one of those people that went along with it, wasn't necessarily like a planner or a strategist of it, as compared to, say, like Mo Brooks or Paul Gosar or some of the other players. So I guess what you could say about him is that he's kind of a lawyer's lawyer. He's pretty sedate. Like if you talk to him, he's like pretty chill. He hated the tech companies. When he and I met to talk about the tech companies, we, in 2018, he went off on like how corrupt they were, how they were harming all the public. And he had sort of like kind of like consumer harm arguments against them, and not just the typical, oh, they're censoring conservatives kind of thing. He was like, they're actually censoring religious people, they're shutting down churches. So he was kind of a hater of Facebook, which kind of made me like him a lot. Trying to think what would be other kind of frames on this. I think that's kind of it for that. Now, I've also written a few pieces this week about Silicon Valley. I have another piece coming out soon about Jacob Hellberg, who's the husband of Keith Raboy, and it's kind of all the weird stuff he's been involved with. Basically, he's an Israeli spy that was over at Google, and he was engaged in all kinds of like weird activity around Google and around other kind of Tel Aviv-based startups. And he is, of course, involved in all this politics. He's on the U.S.-China committee. He's a special advisor at Palantir. So we're just going to basically out him as like kind of a weird figure in the next few days. We could also talk maybe a bit about Jason Smith as well. And then, of course, I did a piece on Delian, who is like one of the people at Varda, which is this like fake space startup, and kind of wrote something just generally about how there's not brains in the Republican Party because the Mormons, the Jews, and the gays are basically like increasingly not there for the Republican Party in terms of like being a brain trust for the party. And finally, I wrote a piece about kind of how Silicon Valley is kind of being swept. That basically a lot of the assets that are in Silicon Valley, particularly the Israeli and Chinese ones, but not exclusively, how many of those things are just being swept and taken out in different ways. So that's kind of like where we are right now. I don't know, Tom, is there anything you wanted to add? Is there any other kind of things you think that the public we should be talking about as well? Maybe we could also talk about the main shooter too, because that one was kind
Yeah,
of
that's an interesting one. But no,
you and I have talked a lot about shooters in general, and in fact, like in my kind of private message group that I have, we talk a lot about how a lot of these school shootings, a lot of these like mass shootings, are actually the work of foreign intelligence. So basically, identifying people that are suggestible or mentally ill or have some like larger health concerns. And I've written about that at my Substack too, about basically like how you can trigger people to commit mass murder. And I think that used to sound like a lot. That used to sound pretty crazy. But I hear from a lot of soldiers the degree to which like a lot of them become very suggestible. There's obviously efforts by people like Christian Angermeyer and by Rebecca Mercer to get soldiers to take LSD and these other various drugs. So I find that pretty interesting because obviously LSD or magic mushrooms can cause all kinds of issues, like we saw with that guy who tried to basically take down a plane. Yeah, that pilot, which is fucking wild. That whole story. Assuming it's all true, which I don't know that I necessarily buy. But yeah, those are kind of the things. And then of course we also have the Dean Phillips story about how Dean Phillips is running, and all of his ties to the Russian Jewish mob through his family and all the bootlegging and all of that. And obviously, he's very plugged in with the Israel world. And you found that really interesting photo, Tom. You want to share that as well about his wife?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
I'll
that
throw
that
that up.
shit was wild. Like, oh, by the way, I just put up the thing in the Jumbotron too. Robert Card, 40, a firearms instructor and longtime member of the Army Reserve, began to hear voices that were saying horrible things about him a couple of months ago when he was fitted for high-powered hearing aids, said Katie Card, who is married to his brother. So, I mean, I think this sounds a little crazy. It sounds a little schizophrenic-y, right? Just to be blunt about it. But I don't think it's that insane, given that we've seen in the past the degree to which a lot of these things get hacked, right? We saw like Zoom, Zoom got hacked multiple times, as did that one that was like taking the videos, if you remember that, the one that was like, what the hell was the name of it? Where people's cameras that were in their homes. What the hell was that? The one that got purchased by Amazon. A Ring camera.
Chime.
Ring
Yeah,
Chime.
Chime too.
Oh,
Ring
ring.
camera
My
was
bad.
the other one too. But anyway, that's kind of what I've been thinking about. I know that was kind of a lot of information.
yeah, and then
Happy to
they're
talk about
reporting
this.
that Card was found with, and this could be a misprint, but this is the way it's worded, was found with two self-inflicted gunshot wounds to the head.
As one does, right?
Yeah, many
And then
such cases.
and then he also apparently had a list of all the things he wanted disposed of. So I
That's
think it's quite
definitely everything you
possible.
do. Yeah,
I don't
before
want
a
to scare
mass.
people, but this is something that I've encountered a lot in the work that we've done with Othram, where you'll find that there's actually a lot of mentally ill people that are used by organized crime as killers, either because they're addicted to drugs or because they are like mentally disturbed or whatever. And there's a degree to which a lot of organized crime uses these people as a way of like killing or taking out other people, and then they dispose of those assets later. And I think that's quite possible what actually happened here. That this guy was basically suggested to kill a bunch of people, did so, thought he was going to be exfiltrated, and then when his people came to come pick him up, they killed him, or he killed himself, or something more complicated than that. Anyway, let's go. Yeah, Tom, why don't you talk about that photo that you just posted?
Yeah, so this Dean Phillips, he got married in I think 2019 to this Annalise Glick, and I went searching on the internet for some photos, trying to find out a little bit more about her, and there's not a whole lot out there, but I did find this picture that I put up in the Jumbotron from 2010, and it's pictured with a guy who was a Manhattan, New York real estate mogul, but then he was busted for rape, soliciting women. He got his victims or victim from sugar daddy websites, and just going to follow up a little bit more with exactly who she is. She also went to the Dalton School, is another item I found. And if everybody that's in this space listening probably knows, the Dalton School is the school Epstein taught at. That's the same school Bill Barr was at. He was the headmaster. Now, of course, she's in her like mid 30s, I believe, now, or maybe close to 40. So obviously they were gone by the time she was there. But it's just was an interesting thing to
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting find, and I recommend people download PimEyes and use PimEyes as a search tool because I think it's a very useful way of understanding some of these people as they become more prominent. Just kind of seeing who they're photographed with, and it's not necessarily something big, but it is
Yeah, and it's
interesting.
weird. It's
And I
weird
think,
how these people they kind of just end up popping up out of nowhere, so to speak. And you see the same thing with like Helberg. You see the same thing with like Lex Friedman, where they're gone for a period of time and you can't account for like anything online of what they were doing. And I'm not saying it's exactly like that here. I'm just saying that these are certain patterns that if you're doing research, you tend to see, and just got to look into it a little bit more.
yeah, I mean, the Helbert thing is interesting because obviously he had a grandfather that fabricated a lot of stuff involving the Holocaust. And we've seen that his family was deeply involved with like the Big Bang Theory, right? So there's this sense in which like a lot of these characters, they're basically like theater kids, or they're like live action role playing players rather than like actual players. And it is interesting to me. So we have Schmidt, this guy Steve Schmidt, who's an advisor to him, to Dean Phillips, who by the way is one of the richer members of Congress. I think he's worth like 70 million plus because he was like heir to this liquor fortune. As I said, a Russian Jewish bootlegging legging, basically fortune. And then he was also involved in like the gelato business. And I think now he owns some coffee shops or something.
Yeah, and
So anyway,
they
he's
have some weird like philanthropy foundations, and then she opened like an art museum in Minnesota, like around 2016 or 2017. And her father, I believe, was a recording artist that like worked for Sony. So
yeah.
I mean,
So it's basically like kind of Israeli heavy, right?
a
They've
little
done a lot of
Russian
stuff with
heavy.
like the Israel
Oh
causes,
yeah, big time.
and yeah. So basically, the question here
You
is,
think they're fans of
what's
Ilhan? Yeah,
probably
I'm gonna say.
not. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. To be honest with you, other than Tom Emmer and Ilhan, like I don't really know that much about Minnesota
Yeah, neither
politics.
do
I've
I.
been to like the Upper Midwest is like kind of alien country to me, just in general. So I know we have some people in this space who are from Minnesota. If they want to chime in on this,
I
you know,
wonder if they have any businesses in the opportunity zone.
yeah, it is interesting, right? Like, so we saw a few years ago when the Jared Kushner riots happened, or the George Floyd riots, I guess, depending on your point of view, that a lot of the properties that were burned down were in areas that were opportunity zones, which is fascinating in its own right. But anyway, so Phillips decides to run. We're sort of doing the vetting on Phillips generally. There's some interesting stuff that Phillips's natural father, died in the Vietnam War, when he was a baby. So he's actually not a born Phillips. He's like a Pfeffer, I think is how you say his natural father's name. So he took his stepfather's name and sort of like went and did that. And it is interesting how these people like kind of show up. They don't really have that much of a history, and then they kind of go about things accordingly. And how much their kind of personal biography, life story is fascinating. So, like we were talking earlier, Mike Johnson was born to a teen mom, right? His parents were divorced, so he's pushed things like covenant marriage, which are like one of these things that make it harder to get divorced in the state of Louisiana. It's quite a rare thing too. I understand there's actually not that many people who actually opt for a covenant marriage, but he's sort of involved with all that. And then of course you posted that photo of Mike Johnson with like the Left Beyond guy. What is his name? Cameron or something? Kirk Cameron. Is that right, Tom? I kind of forget that guy's
Yeah,
name,
Kirk
but
Cameron.
Kirk Cameron, his eschatology has changed though since
yeah,
the Left Behind
You
series.
also may have seen him in Growing Pains.
yeah. I haven't seen any of that shit in a very long time, but anyway. So I guess what we would just say generally is yeah. So the website that Tom uses is called PimEyes, PIM space
It's
EYES.
just one word.
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
PimEyes, all one word. And it's controversial, so you may want to be careful about using a credit card or whatever. But who the fuck knows who really started that
yeah, and
company?
it doesn't scrape it. It's never scraped any social media website. So like it does.
Yeah, it's not as powerful as
Yeah,
Clearview, which is the company that I
exactly.
co-founded, but it is like a pretty powerful engine. I've used it myself in the past. But anyway, welcome,
Hey,
Richard.
how are you doing, Chuck? I
Doing all right.
yeah, I did
Uh,
some brief research on our new Speaker of the House, and I did look into covenant marriage. Um, it is kind of funny. You can now get coveted gay married because everyone's equal. not sure how many
what?
gays are
Why not?
jumping at the thought.
I kind of want to meet some of those guys, personally. I feel like they'd be a very
Although I
interesting
guess all
conversation.
lesbian
You know what I
couples
mean?
are kind of like effectively covenant married.
So my parents, when I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts was one of the first states to have gay marriage. I think actually the first state. And my parents had a neighbor who since moved to New Hampshire, but he was a gay divorce
Yeah.
attorney. and he ultimately like saw the business opportunity of gay marriage for his business. And he was talking to my dad one time, and he was like, my dad was specifically like, let's just face it, all marriages end up being gay in the end, right? And I've just always thought about that as like, gay in like the lame sense. I've always thought about that over the years because there's some kind of truth to it,
Yeah.
But anyway, I find Mike Johnson to be a very earnest man and to be he's an interesting cat. Like, let me put it that way. And I actually think we may be pleasantly surprised by how much he goes along with Biden.
Well, yeah. I mean, I saw that Laura Loomer was getting freaked out that he's not going to take away funding from Ukraine, and that's what Trump wants. So I can see that.
He's not. By the way, he's not a big. He was a reluctant convert to Trumpism.
Yeah.
So that's kind of thing to understand. And then he
really converted. He had the zeal of a convert once converted.
Well, this is always the question with these types, right? Is how sincere is the holy roller, right? That's always the question.
Well, he's sincere enough to do maybe half-hearted or like not full Monty election denial attempts.
See, this is the mistake I think that people are making. Okay. So, like, I was around when all this election denial stuff was going on. I was actually informing on it for the FBI, in case people are curious about it. And Johnson was not one of the main instigators. He wasn't even in the top, 15 or 20 of them.
Right.
His view, if I recall correctly, was that basically Trump is owed a courtroom hearing, and that basically, historically, there have been a number of Democrats who've opposed elections. One can think of Cynthia McKinney being against the 2004 election.
Sure.
And it basically, they would basically just register their complaint, and then that would be that, right? They'd take it up to the Supreme Court. If they lost, well, they lost. But he kind of took it as an attorney for the Alliance Defense Fund or the Alliance Defending Freedom later. He kind of treated it kind of like one of those cases, right? As something that they were just kind of going to litigate up the court chain.
Yeah.
And he kind of treated it kind of like he was he treated it very lawyerly and very legalistic. He didn't treat it like Gosar or Mo Brooks or Andy Biggs or any of those others who kind of treated it like it was time for a coup or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, I think he actually probably should get something of a pass on that. Just because of fog of war and all the rest of it.
Right.
Yeah, he was not a bomb thrower. Let's put it that way. He was.
Well, no, but he's not a bomb thrower in anything.
No. I mean, he is extremely anti. He believes that basically all the sinfulness of casinos and gambling and basically strip clubs and the like led to his parents' marriage collapsing.
Okay.
So he is anti-gambling. And one of my friends who knows him pretty well says that he hates the casino Jews, like Steve Wynn and Sheldon Adelson and all that. And he actually thinks that the problem of Israel is that Israel is not holy enough. That basically it has allowed itself to kind of be Vegas on the Mediterranean. Which is interesting, given that Netanyahu's political support kind of comes from those people. So I think he's actually a more fascinating figure. And then, of course, he's the Alliance Defending Freedom. They're based in Scottsdale, which is a mob town in Arizona, and they also have an international affiliate, which is in Vienna, Austria, which of course is heavily Russian. So I've always treated Mike Johnson as more of a Russophile than an Israeli type, an Israeli firster type. And when he and I spoke, I want to say it was 2 years ago. It was right before the 2020 election. He was very spooked by how much the oil infrastructure in Louisiana and gas infrastructure was compromised by the Chinese. So he's not a bumpkin. He's kind of like the head boy at the prep school who wins the scholarship. He's just, he's the kind of guy that you would have as your neighbor and maybe would allow to watch your dog, right?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't necessarily have him over for the barbecue because he might be like Mr. Flanders, He's kind of. That would be like the way I would describe him.
Yeah, all of that is fair. I mean, I don't hate him personally or something.
By the way, his views on Pornhub were fascinating. Like we talked about Pornhub at this like a lot. Yeah, I was invited to the Family Research Council because I hated the Southern Poverty Center, or Southern Poverty Law Center, or whatever it was back in the day. And he was a very fascinating figure because he basically treated Pornhub like it was this giant human trafficking network, which I think is actually not wrong. I think it's just kind of a lot. But anyway, so he was a fascinating guy when I chatted with him, and he was very, very big on the tech companies are basically dangerous for our society. And we were sort of talking a little bit more about that earlier. But anyway, let's go to some hands. I know we have Andy. I don't know which order people are in, but why don't you let's go Andy, Mike, Patrick, and then Dana. Go ahead. Andy.
So two things. First, we were mentioning LSD, and it's interesting. The second biggest podcast in the nation is the Sean Ryan Show, I believe, and he's a big advocate for microdosing shrooms, which I think is really dangerous. But
yeah, by the way, most of those products, right? So I wrote about this earlier about Roman Abramovich, and like, there's a lot of Russian and Chinese and Israeli money in basically getting us all to do drugs, whether it's and something like I posted this on my company Traitwell, my genetics company, that there's a gene that something like 1 in 100 people have, which is that if you smoke enough pot, you can trigger schizophrenia. And so, we're seeing a lot more people out that are homeless as we're mainstreaming pot. And we're also seeing a lot more people who are schizophrenic. And it does appear that this Card fellow was schizophrenic. So, yeah, go on, Andy.
Makes a lot of sense. And then, so, excuse me, my question. So, I don't know if you remember, this pertains to a little bit to what you were talking about, Gaetz. So, I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago during the whole ethics thing, Gaetz went on Tucker Carlson's show, and there was kind of a really awkward interview. I don't. Hopefully, you remember
as well. I mean, I can tell you. So I know what Gaetz was talking about on that show because it was April 1st, 2021. He went on the show and he was talking about how, like, you met this woman that whatever, and Tucker was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, they met at the Tabard Inn, and I know because her name is Brianna Garcia, and I was there because Matt Gaetz and I had dinner with his then girlfriend, who I think she ended up being like an intern for like one of the Democratic congressmen. And, she was like 22 or 21 or something, and he was like 34 or 35 or whatever. So anyway, we were having dinner at the Tabard Inn, and Tucker Carlson and I think Peter Thiel, actually, they were all upstairs at the Tabard Inn in that kind of like long room there. And I went to the bathroom and saw that Tucker Carlson was there. And I was like, oh, hey, Tucker, what's up? And so we were then invited up to join that conversation that was like taking place. And Tucker sat right next to Matt, and Brianna was on the other side of him. So like they all met each other. They all had dinner, like next to each other. So I think that was what that whole thing was back in the time, if that makes sense.
Why was Tucker? So to be honest, that conversation made me trust Tucker not at all and trust Gaetz not at all.
No, Tucker's profoundly dishonest because Tucker was like having extramarital affairs all around DC. And that's really what Tucker's most afraid of, like coming out, because he married the woman he first, I think, met in high school. Like they went to like prep school together or something like that. I think he was the headmaster's daughter or something like that. And so anyway, he was always like seeing other women or like whatever. He was always engaging in like weird sex stuff, as a lot of those Fox News hosts do, by the way. And
so maybe I was mistaken in mistrusting Gaetz over that. It seems like Tucker's kind of the untrustful individual in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, basically what happened was that Gaetz was targeted by the Israelis in large measure because Gaetz had normalized a lot of marijuana stuff in the state of Florida. And the Israelis wanted it to be through their licensing regime. And I think he had set it up in a different way than they liked. So they kind of used the fact that he had like gone to some of their events. But it was basically Bill Barr trying to settle the score because Bill Barr hated Matt Gaetz' father, Don Gaetz, who is very plugged in with the U.S. intelligence community and with Jeb Bush and all of that. So there's all these like bad blood relationships that go back. There's like intergenerational conflict.
I
But
threw
anyway,
the News of War video, which is really good. If anybody's not watched it, it's 20 minutes long, and it kind of explains this pretty well. And I threw it up in the jumbotron.
what is this, Tom? Oh
The
yeah, that one's pretty
News of
good
War.
actually. Yeah, if
Yeah.
people haven't seen that one, they should. And then Gaetz, I know Bloom posted something earlier about this, about yeah, I'll share this one too because I think this is interesting. About so basically the Israelis were coming for Gaetz because he was one of three members of Congress on the Republican side to oppose going to war against Iran during the Trump years. Uh, so that's kind of an interesting backstory. The other one being Thomas Massey, who got challenged by Lynn Wood, that kind of nutbag, and then the final one being Francis Rooney, who was a kind of like deep state, George Herbert Walker Bush, Catholic, Republican based in what became Byron Donald's district. So yeah, fascinating stuff. Anyway, anything else, Andy? We go to the next one.
I know you're friends with Gates, and so I don't know. To me, and this is all speculative and just kind of my gut instinct, but he seems a little bit to me like he was made in a lab, a little too polished. What is do you think that he's compromised in any way, or do you think that he's a good actor? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, he has his sincere convictions, which are not mine, and he's very stubborn, and he has a certain worldview. He's very German, right? I think would be the way I would describe him. He's kind of, he comes from like basically a Germanic WASP family on his father's side that's like very pro Winston Churchill. And then on his mother's side, he comes from a kind of like redneck wild side. And so he's kind of like those two things are in tension with him, himself. Um, what do I think? I mean, I think he's probably one of the more intelligent politicians I've ever encountered. I don't necessarily agree with him on every issue, but everything he does is extremely tactical and extremely thought through, and the timing of it is very important as well. Now, I know what he said to me in private. I don't necessarily like to talk about what people say in private if they're, friends or whatever. But I can tell you that like he has a strategy for most things he engages in, and he's a lot more sophisticated than I think people give him credit for. And I think as time goes on, that's going to become more and more apparent. Um, Even his critics, and I know, Dana would probably be a critic of. Basically, the thing to understand is that a lot of us who are like kind of like rising people in the Republican Party, we had been targeted in different ways by the Israeli network. And Gates had been targeted, Arthur Bloom's been targeted. I'd argue to some extent Richard's been targeted. Um, and that basically there's a kind of like brotherhood or alliance that has formed because you start to realize that a lot of the Likud Israelis like to go after those of us who are kind of weird and that are like independently minded people that don't like toe the Likud line on things. So anyway, that would be sort of how I would explain it. And I do think people should watch that Sinews of War video about who framed Matt Gaetz because it's really interesting to look at. And I put that thing up in the Jumbotron too about how the Israelis came after Gaetz because I think it's worth understanding like why they did that and all the kind of internal fights there as well. But yeah, good.
Is he gonna? Sorry, I don't mean to like take over the space, but is he gonna with all the there? It seems like there's a large population of Orthodox Jewish people moving to Florida. Is he going to face difficulties if he is opposing some of their ideology
Well, the question,
in
of course, is like,
future endeavors?
could he win a Republican primary? Right? That's the question.
Right.
And I think the answer is yes, he could win a Republican primary. So then it's him against a Democrat, and it depends who the Democrats nominate in Florida.
Well, is he going to oppose all of this? I mean, I have Matt. I mean, I know you have this friendship with him. I have Matt Gaetz pegged as maybe like someone who signals as Ron Paul when it comes to spending and budgets and all that kind of stuff, but and who very well might be against funding a war in Ukraine, but is basically would have been on board with the terror war and will be on board 100% with the Gaza war and whatever else
Oh no, I wouldn't go
emanates
that
from that.
far. I think what you should understand is that many people pay lip service to a number of these players, and they don't actually intend to follow through on it. I mean, look, it's going to be very simple, right? Like the all of the Ukraine money and all of the Israel money is going to be allocated. Biden's probably going to do them all in one big bill, which is the border Ukraine Israel bill, and that'll definitely pass because there'll be no opposition to it. So you can signal because you realize that the base is where the base is, right? The base doesn't want endless war in Ukraine in the Republican Party, full stop. And, Matt's view is that because he represents the most net member of military, members in the country in terms of the Florida's first district, that he has an obligation to his neighbors and as a representative there to basically keep the United States out of wars. Now, is Matt more sympathetic to the Russian point of view on a lot of topics? Yeah, but it's sort of unclear. Like, Florida is filled with Russians, right? And it's also filled with lots of Israelis. And it's basically a mob state, right? And he wants to be governor. As I've said, he wants to be warden of all the mobsters, basically, in that area. So he has to sort of play these things much more strategically. He would never come out and say this, but that's very much like what he's doing. So like when he goes and he talks about Israel and Judea and Samaria and everything, like I know that he does not believe that. He's just, he sometimes will occasionally be hyperbolically pro-Israel, just as kind of a joke or kind of like a dig. You'll notice that he is not like a Tom Cotton. He's not like a Lindsey Graham or a Mark Wayne Mullen or any of these other people that like suck up to all the Israelis. Matt has gone on precisely one trip to Israel. And in fact, if you watch Matt's video, let me see if I can find it.
That's a little bit like descending a murderer by saying he's not a serial killer or something.
No, I think it's more look, there are people who are on.
We're not dealing with Hannibal Lecter here, guys. I mean,
no, but I think that there are
people
who are on the payroll, right, of the Israelis and who are their assets or whatever. And then there are the people who kind of like are pragmatic about it, right? Which is the pragmatic situation is that like the Republican Party, as we know it, effectively like it's 100% pro-Israel. There are no real dissenters from that, like period. And I don't like that personally. Like it's a major reason I left the Republican Party because I think it's deeply compromised in all these ways. But yeah, look at this video that Gaetz. So Jordan, or Arthur Bloom publishes this tweet, basically talking about Jake Novak being involved in this Israeli intelligence op to attack him. And Gaetz replied back by posting this video that he did, which is pretty sophisticated about the efforts to basically run this intelligence operation on him. And over the years, I've said to Matt, like, basically, we really need to be strongly against the Israelis. We need to be like loud about this or that. And he was basically like, not yet. When the time is right, the time is right. And so I think he's, this is a guy who's nursed a resentment against Kevin McCarthy since he first met him, and he's basically hated him ever since, when Matt was elected in 2016. So I think that people need to understand that this is a guy who's shown himself to be extremely patient, extremely disciplined, and extremely lethal when the time is correct. And I have no doubt that he will settle up with everybody who did him harm when the time is correct. Remember, Richard, he's one of 435 people.
Right.
He's very loved in Florida.
Yeah, I think he's going to be the next governor.
I think he easily could be.
Yeah. Who do you think is a challenger to him in Florida?
Well, I don't know, because you had Rick Scott before, DeSantis.
My view is it's going to be him versus Ashley Moody, and Ashley Moody works for Leonard Leo, and I think Leonard Leo, anyone who touches the Leonard Leo network is a non-starter, I think.
I just think if a male is running against a woman in Florida, he's going to be fine. That's just my opinion.
I think it's going to be interesting. So Matt and Trump have a kind of like surrogate son, surrogate father relationship that is very deeply felt. But yeah, I think Ashley Moody's going to run. I think Ashley Moody is going to have like all the weird DEA agents. She's married to the DEA, and she's going to have like the Leonard Leo connection. But I think Matt will win because Matt will have the rednecks that will vote for him in the primary, and I think that'll be enough to put him over the edge.
I think people underestimate him. He's very smart. I mean, as a Democrat most of my life, and he lives 30, 45 minutes from me. He's in my sister's district in Florida. She loves him. Everybody loves him there. And if you watch him speak or what he does locally, he's very engaged. They all love him. I mean, even the people that go out that don't like him still go out to
Yeah,
sit
he,
and
he
listen to
told me
him.
that the secret to his success in Florida is just being obsessed with constituent services.
Yeah, he's very involved.
And
I mean, he is.
yeah,
He's hands on.
yeah. I think he's ultimately going to be I think he's ultimately going to be the governor, and then I think he'll be on this short list of people who could run for president after Biden. Though I suspect 2028 is probably too soon. Um, and he's still quite young. I mean, he's like 41, 42, something like that. So I think he's got some time. Let's let's go to Mike real quick, and then we'll go to Patrick and then Dana. By the way,
Hi,
if anyone else
Charles.
wants
Thank
to
you.
come up, and we don't know you or you haven't spoken in my spaces before, just message me or Tom what you want to say, or if there's some topic you want to bring up. We're happy to have lots of people in these spaces, but usually we do these things like quick in the form of information or questions, because honestly, like there's lots of spaces where people just go off on their opinions and like those are fun or whatever. But we do record these spaces. We do want people to like think about these issues, and we want to like get real information out so that people can actually like draw their own conclusions about what's going on in the news. But yeah, go ahead, Mike. Mike, you there? I think you muted yourself, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So I live in Silicon Valley, and thus my question is this. What were the most interesting bits about Silicon Valley that you found in the course of your investigation?
Well, for those who are who are sort of not familiar, I wrote this piece about basically how the counterintelligence sweep of Silicon Valley is beginning, and that it's sort of well underway. And so basically, there's three venture funds in Silicon Valley that I think are of a special importance. They are Founders Fund, Peter Thiel's fund. They are Andreessen Horowitz, which obviously Mark Andreessen, Ben Horowitz's firm, and then ultimately Sequoia. And the game that's been played by a lot of these sort of like professional China hawk types is what they'll do is they'll be like, China, 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 China's terrible, China's terrible. Give me and my pro-Israel and my compromise venture fund the money instead. And I sort of go into like the history of some of this in a piece I wrote. But basically, look, the truth of the matter is that like a lot of these venture capital firms are fake. And they basically raise a bunch of money in a low interest rate environment. They pay themselves big fat fees. And then it's basically like 7 to 10 years before we discover that they're frauds. And I see Loading is in here. I mean, Loading, and I've talked a lot about, or Machine Maverick, and I've talked a shitload about Delian being a fraud. Delian's the one who runs this like space company where they do like supposedly do manufacturing up in space. And I actually talked to the FAA and the Air Force about how he's a fraud. And they actually barred him from re-entry into the United States. So now he's trying to re-enter into Australia, and we'll see if that happens as well. And I sort of talked about his weird like personal relationship with Keith Raboy. Keith Raboy was an executive at Square, and he was he's basically a pederast. I mean, he is an extremely homosexual man, and he's basically offered sex for he's offered money for investment in companies if people will have sex with him, and that's pretty fucked up, especially seeing his founders fund has a lot of LPs that are like pension funds. I mean, KKR is a fund. So basically, what I'm doing is the traditional approach to a lot of this stuff has just been like, no, we're not going to go there. We're not going to talk about how these companies really work. We're going to treat Peter Thiel like he has something interesting to say, And honestly, like the only reason we care what Peter Thiel has to say is because he's rich. The only reason he's rich is because he's got all this money that he's been allowed to manage in different ways. And there's a lot of problems with like Peter's story and account of himself. There's a lot of problems with Mark Andreessen's account of himself. And so anyway, the piece I wrote was basically going into all the bullshit at all these venture funds and all the fake deals. And I think as basically next year rolls around, I think a lot of these venture funds are going to start blowing up in different ways. And I think that's something to kind of watch and keep an eye on. It's a good question. Let's go to Patrick.
You were talking about Robert Carr before, not to change the subject.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, what do you think? I mean, you're a military man, like, or an ex-military. What's your read on it?
Well, you're gonna hate this, but like, from what I know about Robert Carr, and by the way, like my ex-wife, she moved to Saco, Maine after she left me, but so she's there with my daughter.
Yeah, by the way, I've been to Saco. My sister actually lives near there in Maine, so I'm familiar with the area pretty well. I've been up there a number of times. So, yeah, it's pretty wild.
So kind of hit home. I was worried about her and my baby, my first baby, but like, from what I read about Robert Carr, he's never seen combat before. And like, this is what I'm concerned about. Like, unlike you, I'm kind of like skeptical to mental health issues. Like, I've studied math at UConn, and I've only took like when I got my bachelor's degree from UConn, I only took like for science classes like chemistry and organic chemistry. But like, I sometimes think that like mental health, like labeling and like labeling is kind of dangerous. Like I've had multiple TBIs in the military, like, and I have my doctorate degree, but like I've had multiple TBIs in the military, and I've seen combat, so they like kind of combined, at least the VA did for my retirement, kind of combined like PTSD and TBIs like as one. So I'm kind of skeptical, but like
I mean, I certainly agree that there's like a lot of like bullshit in the mental health space, and that honestly, like there should be a lot more rigor in it generally. But it is the case that like we have a lot of people in this country that are like not quite mentally there, and there's a lot of people who are in this country because their own countries shipped them here because they were crazy or they were disputatious or whatever. I think that is kind of the reality of being an American is that a lot of us have ancestors that like couldn't hack it or were too crazy in the old country. So I do think we over medicate.
So do you think like sometimes they like label these guys as crazy and then they turn crazy, or do you think they were always crazy? Because like
I think it's kind of a combination of the two. I mean, look, I do think that if you take some of these psychotropic drugs and you go off of them, you can have really crazy, situations. And I don't know if anyone's run into people who've taken antidepressants, but when they go off of them and all like the weird things that happen and all the weird chemical effects that happens to their brain, I think these things are really bad. And I think there's something to kind of think through there. I don't know.
So do you think it's like a double-edged sword? That's what I was pretty much asking you.
No, I believe that basically, so what I believe generally about most shootings is they seem to take place at very convenient times in foreign policy. And, I think that there's a lot of crazy shit that goes on in the world. And that, like, think about it like this. Let's say you had a database of all of our mentally ill people in the country, right?
Yeah, but like, that's what I'm asking you. Do you think,
let me explain this, Patrick, because this is important. This is an important distinction. Okay. There's a book, which we've talked about before in these spaces, called America Against America, which is effectively by Wang Huning. He's like the third most powerful person in China. And he talks about basically triggering a civil war in the United States. And in the book, he talks about basically how we're a very lonely country. We don't really have families. Many of us spread out. We basically spend all of our time watching TV and later being on the computer. And that basically, like, we are like craving connection as Americans. But unlike other countries where people live like 2 or 3 generations to a home, we are basically like alone in our McMansions and by ourselves. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out in like many, many cases now, we have situations where people finally break into the person's Twitter account or Facebook account or whatever, and then they see messages from people encouraging them to commit mass murder or to basically do otherwise antisocial activity. And my theory of the case, for what it's worth, is that basically there are concerted efforts to build databases of mentally ill people. And sometimes those databases are built by looking for things that are like antisocial behavior, like posting swastikas or saying other things about the Jews writ large. Sometimes they're, but basically there's an effort afoot on our social media platforms to identify the mentally ill, or to the discontented or the antisocial, and to kind of weaponize them against the United States or against like normal civilians.
Well,
I think
I
it happens all
kind
the
of
time.
find that interesting. Like, I don't disagree with that personally, but like at the same time, like I feel like it's a double-edged sword. Like when I was going through my shit, like with the evaluations, I was always afraid that they were going to label me crazy. And like,
Yeah, I
do
mean,
you
it's
think?
certainly something that happens, right? People try to label their spouse, crazy to get their kids. I mean, there's a lot of abuses, and I know Eric Garland has talked about some of these things, so we don't necessarily have to belabor it. But like, same thing, Chris Vickery was declared mentally ill. There are many examples of like mobbed up psychiatrists or others targeting people and falsely labeling them. I myself had a similar situation where people tried to like call me crazy as a way of basically precluding me from getting a security clearance at one point, and to basically have it in my file. And then I just like very politely took a psychological evaluation from three different, at random psychologists or psychiatrists, and they were like, "No, there's nothing wrong with him. He's very bright and maybe like a little prone to making connections that others don't see, but he's not mentally ill by any stretch."
No,
So
no,
yeah,
I've been through that. I was a CID agent. I had a TSSCI clearance. I think it's expired by now. But what I'm saying is like, do you think like it's almost like a double-edged sword, where like
I don't know what you mean by a double-edged sword. Like you keep
well,
repeating
like
that
you
phrase.
take someone who's been through something, and then you try to label them crazy, and then they
Oh, well,
act.
of course. I mean, they want to send us all to go fight wars for Zog, right? And like, if you go to Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever, and you see some fucked up things, you're going to come back, even if you physically come back like whole. You're mentally going to be pretty fucked up. And there are examples we know of, like in Matthew Cole's book Code Over Country. He talks about basically how they try to select for, antisocial and even psychopathic or sociopathic Navy SEALs. And you could imagine a situation in which you had a database of all these Navy SEALs, and you could compromise them in different ways. And there's one of the companies I invested in was started by two Navy SEALs, and one of them had like a real psychological break. The other one was telling me how like the Israelis would go and like party with them. They'd have all these like hot Israeli chicks with them. Some of the guys would fuck them, and then they'd talk about how they should all go to war with Iran. It's like that kind of thing is like what I'm talking about. And yeah, I think look, there's these psychological operations that are run by other countries against our service members, and it's all about basically trying to render our military like feckless and useless. So yeah, I
So
think you're
like
correct.
everyone who sees combat, like or who has been in combat, is like has some mental health issue.
Well, not necessarily everyone, but obviously different people have genetic predispositions to to all kinds of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's not really in contention or really in debate. But let's go to Dana real quick.
I have some comments on what y'all were just talking about, but my question that I have is back on Mike Sullivan, and I listened to everything that you said about him tonight, and
You mean
I
Mike
mean Mike
Johnson? You
Johnson, I'm
mean?
sorry, and I've listened to everything that you've said about him, and I accept what you say, and I can step back and look at him a little bit more carefully, obviously, but there are still
I think it's very hard. By the way, I think Louisiana politics in general are very hard
100%.
for like
So
normal
are the
people to
laws
penetrate.
there. Try to get a law degree there. It's very
Yes.
hard. I mean,
Yeah, it's basically still kind of a part of the French system.
100%. But we do need to question. I don't care. I agree with you that the South has some weird ways that we get children and adopt children and always through some type
Yeah, I
of
think you're right
church.
about this.
But
Like I read your stuff earlier that you were posting about like this black 14-year-old boy who he kind of raises his son, and there's
and
a lot of
had him
weird stuff
before
there.
he got married. and and he
Yes.
you couldn't have adopted a child even back then without being married and all kinds of.
Well, I don't think it was a legal adoption, full stop,
Sure, but here's what
right?
I did find, okay? And I do think that any child,
By the way, put it up in the jumbotron if the stuff you have too,
okay,
if
I'll get
anybody's
it. I
interested.
have it kind of marked, and I will get it for you because it is already marked. Where normally I don't have my stuff ready for you, but I do think we should question anyone who's ever adopted a child that's under suspicious, under different circumstances like this. So
Yeah, no doubt, and I think especially given the history that we've seen with Denny Hastert, being a pedophile, like I think
100%.
these are real concerns, and I think anyone who would dismiss them without a serious investigation, just because like it's too horrifying to contemplate that, I don't think they really understand how politics really work. So yeah, I'm with you in principle. I'm with
Well,
you.
he admits
Uh,
that he gets this young man through a organization, Ministry, I think it's what it's called, Young Living Ministry. And if anybody wants to look them up, I have the website. I will post it in just a second. But if you go to the website, they talk about, I mean, they're pretty huge. They're all over the world. They're in many areas where I live. And it's the same people I question and have questioned that control a lot of my state and my area where I live on those same committees. So I do have a lot of questions about that. And I think that, what was I going to say? So he admits that, he and his wife on this podcast, that's where he got the young man. So right now, Young Living Ministries is also under lots of scrutiny for sexual things with young girls and young men. So I can send all that
yeah, no, I think you're
information.
right. I
And
mean, look,
I just,
I think you're right to raise these questions. Absolutely.
well, I think he can answer. I mean, if he's innocent, he can answer them, right? So then that's no problem.
Without question, he can answer them, and I do think it's a bit challenging because he adopted him like when he was a
But
minor,
did
but
he
he's now a
adopt him?
grown
Because it's
adult.
not an adoption agency. So that's another thing I have
Right.
a lot of questions about. It's not an adoption agency. So how did you get this young man? And if he can answer it, that's great, but he still should have to answer it.
I agree with you, and especially seeing as it happened like 25 years ago, right?
Yep.
So
He would have
it's
been
not like it
21 or
happened.
22 years old. That's a little
Yeah, so
bizarre.
so he adopted him. So supposedly he like got him or whatever. So he's 51 now, Mike
He's
Johnson is,
9 years older than the
and
young man.
yeah, so he's 9 years older, and it was like 20. I guess it was like 26 years ago would be when it was, right? So yeah, I mean, look, the world was very different 26 years ago, though. Like, I think we should be,
It was more than
and
26 years ago. It was in 1997. And so he got
right.
married in 1999. So he wasn't even married. I mean, that's just all bizarre.
Yeah, it's very strange.
I would like answers.
It is very strange. No, I agree with you, and I do think that like anyone who's doing a profile piece and whatever material you have there, I'll send it to some friends of mine at the Washington Post or writing a profile of him because I do think it's a legit question to ask. Like, what is the real story here? I know the Matt Gaetz story with Nestor. That one is like pretty defensible, I think, which is he was dating her
And you
sister.
answered that for me,
Yeah,
and I was fine with it. Like, if someone can give me a
yeah.
legitimate
I mean,
answer, I'm
I
fine
know
with
that
it.
story, right? And like I also know there's all kinds of weird stuff that happens in the South. Some of which is like just cultural because people have a lot more like flexible, fluid families. I think in the South than we do in like the Northeast or whatever.
Well,
So I'm not
we need to
necessarily.
be questioning our Supreme Court and all their adoptions too, because they are also under very weird circumstances. And I'm surprised no one talks about this more. I mean, I researched that about 3 years ago.
I agree with you. And by the way, I don't think you should be able to do. I mean, I think all adoptions and all children in general, they should all be genetically sequenced.
100%.
Because I think it's a great way to determine like who's whose kid. But yeah, I agree with you. But yeah, I think the research you have there, I was looking at it earlier. I didn't kind of know what to make of it, but I do think you raise really interesting questions, and I think it's something that like should be answered in a profile or by But yeah, it's weird, right? Like, so you're 25 years old,
Less than
right?
that.
So
It was
like,
less than that. He was
well,
22.
how old was he in 1997?
Well, if he's I have to go the date of the article when it states he was 51. I don't even know if that's correct at this point. That may have been 2 years ago. I don't know. I need to look at what the date is to get his accurate dates. We can get.
He has him come in. So like it's pretty easy to figure out, right? He's born
Well, if
in like what
if
year,
he
Mike
adopted him in
Johnson?
1997, the child was
So he was. So he
14.
was. So he would have been. He would have been if he adopted him in. So Johnson himself, if he adopted him in 97, he would have been 25 or 24 years old, right? 20 or
I
26
thought it
years
was
old.
23.
Now,
That's just my opinion.
no. Your math is off, right? Because Johnson is born in Shreveport, yeah, according to his Wikipedia, assuming that's correct, which is a huge assumption, but let's just go with it.
Okay.
So he's born in 1972. So if he adopts the kid in
Okay, I thought he was older than that. All
1997,
right.
he would have been 25. Still, 25 is pretty young in general, right?
And you're not married.
And you're not married, and you're like having somebody live with
And
you
the
who's a
child is
young
not from an
person.
adoption agency. How did you get the
Yes,
child?
yes.
Or how did they give it to you? I mean,
Yeah, what's the true story there? And I think it would be one thing if the child were still a minor in terms of asking these questions, but like obviously he would be like
well, this
in
website,
25 years.
Young Living Ministries, talks about how they're very involved with human trafficking. They're involved with it internationally, and they're also involved with. They don't help young children, but they help teenagers from middle school up find families to basically, help them if they're from drug addicted families or, some kind of trauma. But it's very specific in what they talk about. It's a very strange website. And again,
No doubt, no doubt. But I also think that we need kind of more information. And I think that you're asking the right questions before we kind of go down. I mean, look, it's kind of a big deal to accuse somebody of being a pedophile, right? So like we need to be kind of sure of it before we
well, I'm
really
not
go
saying he's a
there. It
pedophile
is
for sure, but
it is unusual, right? So
something.
what I found interesting when I was researching him is that he claims to have 4 children, but then there's other articles out there from that are basically later articles where he's said to have only 3 children. Uh, so like, which is it, right? Is it 3 biological ones and like 4? I don't know. There's like a lot of weird stuff.
Well, he also has a home in Texas, he and his wife. So I'm so concerned about all these people who are Congress people who have residencies in several states. That's also very bizarre. Just saying that out loud. And then his wife is a pastor, licensed to be a pastor.
No, she's licensed to be a therapist, I
It
believe.
says pastor or something. I'll show you what I have, but
Yeah, show me what you have because I had it that he was
pastoral
a therapist at
licensed is
church.
what it says.
Yeah. Huh.
So,
Yeah, look, it's weird. Look, I'm not going to come here and say that like Johnson is perfectly defensible in every respect because I don't think that that's true, obviously. But I think he's part of a rival network or a more complicated network to Kevin McCarthy's. So to the extent that we get rid of the California Bakersfield mob
sure.
and replace it. Now, what he was saying to me was is that there are all these Chinese Democrats in California that push all the big tech stuff. And I found that very interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
I wouldn't be surprised, but they also have Chinese Republican up
my
there as well. I
suspicion,
don't think it
my
matters.
suspicion is that so he's very close to the trial lawyers in Louisiana. They're very powerful, and my supposition is that he sees an opportunity of sicking the trial lawyers on the big tech players. That would be kind of how I would frame it.
I just don't trust much out of Louisiana. That's just a
I
very
don't either. If I had my druthers,
mob. You can't do anything in New
yeah, if
Orleans
I had my
without
druthers,
paying the
I
mob.
mean, look, Louisiana is a great place to have a beignet and to like
Correct.
have
And
some
coffee.
food or whatever. But like, if you're there after midnight or whatever, if you're there after dark, like there's a non-trivial chance you might get killed anywhere you are in Louisiana. It's a very violent place, and it's a very like casino, money laundering, kind of place. It's like there's a lot of crime there, and it's a pretty disturbing place. So I agree with you. I don't think anyone, there was I mean, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I think what I'm noticing, he's also close to CMP. The
Yeah, but anyone who's a member of Congress who's from the South will be plugged into these networks. The question is, like, how much of these networks is he a part of? Now, I think he is a part of the Family Research Council. I think that is pretty clear, and I think he's very
which has
plugged
a
into
lot of
that network.
problems in the sexual child stuff as
Well,
well.
I mean, the Family Research Council lies about being a church, which is a crime, right?
So does Young Living
Yeah,
Ministries.
they lie. No. I mean, the Family Research Council like claims to be a church. It is not a church,
Right.
and that is a real going concern of like all these church and religious organizations that are fake. We obviously saw today. I don't know if anybody saw that story about Sean Reyes and all like the weird sham charities he has in Utah and how the feds are investigating all of that. Like, so that's the Attorney General of Utah. So very strange stuff.
Yeah, I think they're just money laundering
Obviously.
things. So, and then the churches are too. And then if you are noticing some of the
Yeah, I
people
mean,
that
the
are,
cynical play would be so the cynical argument about Johnson is that if you just have like the Machiavellian view, is that he's taking out the strip clubs and he's taking out the porn shops because he wants to crack down on the money laundering in order to benefit his own preferred way of money laundering, which are all the churches.
well, yeah, I'd like to see him clean out the churches. And I think that they've been blackmailed through all this pedophilia and all of this child sex rape and all
No
of that.
doubt. And also the relationship of these mega churches with the Russians and with others, which is a going concern too. Yeah. Look, I think that basically the journalistic approach.
Oh, I know what I was going to say to you. Okay,
Yeah.
so here's a question I have that y'all were talking about, but it triggered some reading of what I read today. All right, going back to Hobby Lobby, who got those artifacts. They were from Lebanon, and they bought them directly from ISIS, which is also interesting. And who they mailed that to was in Oklahoma City. uh, 10 different shipments, by the way, which the feds, I guess, caught on to 5 of them. 5 got through, 5 did not. But they all went to Oklahoma Hobby Lobbies to like their headquarters at 3 different locations in Oklahoma. And it stated that they were coming from the UAE and Israel. So I find that really bizarre that we're talking about Lebanon and the wars and the different 2 Beirut shooting bombings, or I've been reading them on Jeremy's postings all day today. So I just think it's all very interesting that the religion part, Oklahoma City or Oklahoma, that's where the bombings were from a long time ago. Then you have the Mark Wayne, whatever his name is, that is doing the sex trafficking from Iraq, and then you have now Hobby Lobby is dealing with ISIS from Oklahoma City as well. I mean, that's a lot of Oklahoma City. What the hell's going on with Oklahoma? Is what I'd like to know. Doesn't Tom live there? I'd like to know what is with that state.
Now Tom lives in Missouri, right? Or
Oh,
Kansas,
okay.
the
But what
Kansas
is
side.
with Oklahoma? It's
I mean, there's
bizarre to
always
me.
this weird stuff in Oklahoma. I mean, the network that the
Is it
one
the
of the
Indian
senators,
reservation? What is it?
almost all the senators there and all the politicians there are part of these like weird religious networks, which is
Well, that's a lot of
fascinating.
the South too, but
Yeah.
I don't
I don't
know.
know. I don't know. I mean, I do know that like there's a lot of weird activity there for sure. I want to let somebody else have it. If anybody else has something they want to say, I was going to shut this down around 3 a.m. So unless somebody has anything else kind of pressing or whatever they want to talk about, raise your hand. We'll have you up. Otherwise, maybe we should talk a little bit about the Jason Smith stuff. I know Tom and I were kind of focused on that. Tom, what do you want to like tell people what happened there? Because it's kind of fascinating. Like this, Matt Gaetz basically outs Jason Smith. I don't know. It was an interesting thing. I mean, Smith was implicated in all these weird ways. So yeah, it was a very interesting. it was very interesting, that whole dynamic. You know, you there, Tom, or are you asleep? Maybe Tom's asleep. Good job co-hosting, Tom. Yeah, so basically, the way I would describe this is that Jason Smith is from southeastern Missouri. There's a lot of like criminal stuff going on in Missouri right now. A lot of it's getting cleaned up. And he was the head, he's like one of the youngest, chairman ever of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is basically like sets a lot of the taxation policy and how all of that works. And that's kind of what he's a part of, that kind of network there. And what can I say about this? I mean, generally speaking, he's very pro-Israel. He's very plugged in with the Israel networks. Was very pro Kevin McCarthy. He attacked Gaetz as basically being a liar, and Gaetz, retaliated in kind by saying, "At least I don't live a lie." And of course, that was a kind of reference to Smith being gay, which is of course well known in D.C., but it's not more public, elsewhere. So yeah, it's interesting stuff. Yeah, so a 5-year statewide investigation into the drug trafficking and other criminal activity of the Irish mob gang, an Oklahoma-based prison gang, has resulted in 125 defendants being convicted. Yeah, let's put this up in the Jumbotron. Thanks, Machine Maverick, for sending it. I think that's another kind of weird Oklahoma angle. I knew some people that were trying to get into the drug trade or the marijuana trade in Oklahoma, and I, of course, gave them a far berth. But yeah, very weird state, a lot of strange stuff. My grandfather, the one I posted the photo of today, he was from Oklahoma, from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. So it's a place that I know pretty well, but it is a pretty fucked up place, no doubt about it. Any other final thoughts anyone has? If not, I'm going to shut down the space in like 5 minutes or so. But yeah, I think Dana's correct about a lot of this stuff deserving of further attention. And I think we're going to be doing a lot more research on these topics. So if this interests you, please message me. If you're a good researcher, send me your research. And if it's particularly good, I'll invite you into some of these spaces that I have and host that are more private. With that, I hope everybody has a good weekend. Happy Saturday morning for those of you who are, on the East Coast. And then, just say generally, read the Substack, read some of the pieces that we've been putting out. I think there's a lot of stuff to talk about. Somebody's asking me, can we talk about how close we came to war with Iran during the Trump presidency? I don't really want to do the geopolitics stuff today. I don't know how close we were. It's hard to say definitively. But it's certainly the case that a lot of the Netanyahu Israelis wanted to drive up the price of oil and to cause a lot of chaos and uncertainty. And to some extent, the fact that the Chinese have now switched sides and are helping the Palestinians and helping the sort of Iranians and the Saudis, I find that very interesting. Basically, it seems to me that they're kind of cutting, getting rid of a relationship with the Israelis. So I find that very fascinating. In any event, I hope everybody has a good weekend, and the space is recorded. Please share it with other people, and hope to hear from you soon. Thanks, Dana and Tom. Chat soon. Bye.